Well, Ed, on the afternoon of October 17th, 1975, I'm finally getting around to answering your tape. By way of an initial test, let me mention a couple of things. The KEHNs are pronounced Keen. I hope to have both Eddie and Chet in on these tapes before we get through. The material that I am using is in a box up in the attic, which I cannot find. Eventually I'll come across it. However, I have condensation, a good portion of it, in articles written by two students at Russell Sage College here in Troy. The earliest one was done by Joy Cadman, Kaadtmann, in May of 1948. It was entitled Salesmanship Manual on Meneely Bells, although I don't quite see the connection between the name and the contents. The second one was a history seminar paper done by Emily Guile, Guile, a year later, called The History and Romance of the Meneely Bell Company. Finally, I have a set of papers that I made up for my daughter-in-law, who asked me one time to give her the history of the Meneely family. Out of my possession right now is a letter and a complete set of slides done by a student at RPI, the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute here in Troy. And it happens to be in the hands of Bill DeTurk, who stopped by about 2 weeks ago and has taken them with him to duplicate. He also has several of the letters that I may be quoting later on. So much for the preliminaries. I think we ought to start with some of the history of the family. And to do that properly, particularly in connection with the making of bells, I'm going to go back to the Hanks, Hanks. My aunt, Eugenia Meneely Snelling, who was the widow of the Episcopal rector in Nantucket, collected a great deal of family history. And I am indebted to what she did for much of the information that I could obtain. The family is traced, the Hanks family is traced back to Malmesbury in England. And there is some talk about how they fought in the Battle of Edington under Alfred the Great and were awarded a tract of land as a reward for their services. We start with Benjamin Hanks, who arrived in Plymouth in 1699. He moved on to Pembroke and then to Sagish or Saquish Island, which is at the mouth of Plymouth Harbor. Today, I believe that is a peninsula. The family moved on to Connecticut, and a second Benjamin built a, quote, spacious house, end of quote, on Hanks Hill in Mansfield, known as the Mansion House. Next in my family line is Uriah, who lived at the Mansion House. An interesting story about him is that he was born a Presbyterian. One day he heard a sermon which was so revolting to his mind that he up and left the church. The result of that was that the parish collector confiscated the knives, forks, pewter, and plates from his sideboard and sold them all at auction. One of his grandsons, Julius Hanks, is quoted as saying that Uriah was a famous blacksmith, carpenter, gunsmith, nail cutter, and wire drawer, a remarkably ingenious man and my revered grandfather. Uriah had a large family, and the youngest son, Rodney, turned out to be the same age as his nephew. And both of them married sisters in the Freeman family. This, of course, made things very confusing in going back through to see who was cousin of whom. The nephew's name was Horatio, and he and Rodney built the first water-powered silk mill in America in 1810. One of their specialties was the carding of wool into rolls for the farmers' wives to spin into yarn for stockings. The silk mill was in operation as late as 1875. It was Rodney's daughter, as we will see, married Andrew Meneely. In checking the Hanks genealogy, there's an open question about relationship to Nancy Hanks, the mother of Lincoln. Carolyn Wright Hanks, Hitchcock, who traced through many of the old records, says that Nancy was the daughter of Joseph Hanks and Nancy Shipley Hanks. She was orphaned at the age of 9, was adopted and raised by her uncle and aunt, Richard and Lucy Shipley Berry. She married Thomas Lincoln, and Abraham was the second of 3 children. Now, Joseph Hanks was the son of William Hanks. It's possible that this is William Hanks, born in 1704, and an uncle of Uriah, who left Massachusetts for Virginia and later crossed the mountains into Kentucky. However, this has never been proven. On the other hand, the Hanks family has not dropped out of the picture completely. Only last summer, I had the pleasure of having my picture taken with my cousin, Nancy Hanks, who is director of the National Endowment for the Arts, and was here in Albany at the presentation of awards statewide made by the New York State Council for the Arts to various organizations. One of these was the Rensselaer County Junior Museum, of which I happen to be one of the trustees. I now go back to Colonel Benjamin Hanks, who was the oldest brother of my ancestor Rodney, some say that he made the first church bell in America. But in another article, it says that Abel Parmele, P-A-R-M-E-L-E, was the first in Connecticut, and that he even had a petition in 1736 to the Assembly for a monopoly on the casting of large bells, but this was not granted. In 1738, John Whittier of Fairfield was in the same business. We have no record of what was going on in Massachusetts or the other colonies. Benjamin was trained as a clockmaker by Thomas Harlan. During the Revolution, although he started off as a Tory, he found he was unable to get a set of clockmaker's tools. In fact, the British discouraged any type of manufacture in the colonies. They wanted to provide work for their home population, and also to get revenue from import taxes. In some way, though, Benjamin managed to have a set of tools smuggled to him, and they arrived in New York on a British vessel, and he had to make his way secretly between both the American and British lines to obtain them. On the way back, he was followed by British agents, and he knew this. When he got to the house, he put the tools into a secret cabinet and left the house, hoping that the agents would follow him, as they did. Somehow or other, he managed to shake them, and he had his tools to work with. As a clockmaker, he was very successful. At 21 years of age, he made a chiming clock, which he gave to his father, and this stayed in the family for generations. He designed a wind-driven, self-winding tower clock, which was installed in the old Dutch church in New York. And he was given a patent. He was in the stocking weaving business. He made looms. He made surveyors' compasses, brass cannons, and bells. He was also a gold and silversmith. You hear of diversification today in some of the modern companies. It seems to me that all they have to do is to look back and see what was going on then. It's rather interesting that one of the plaudits he received as a bell founder came from the Fairfield Gazette. He had made a bell for the Litchfield Meeting House, and the comment was that it is well wrought and sounds very grateful. Bells have always been personified to a certain extent, and this seems to carry it to the fullest possible. In 1808, he took his son Julius Hanks into partnership, and they started a foundry opposite Troy in Gibbonsville. Gibbonsville later became West Troy, and finally Watervliet, or rather it is a part of Watervliet, and was of West Troy. There's a question, but I don't think the dates tie in, but the Watervliet Arsenal, which makes cannons still, was being started up at about that time. And Benjamin, being in the cannon business, may have felt that he could work along with the arsenal. Now, Benjamin Hanks and Son were also still casting bells in the old foundry in Mansfield. And another son, Truman Hanks, was managing the Mansfield foundry and advertising their availability from both places, as well as surveyors' compasses upon the Rittenhouse improved plan. In 1816, Benjamin was granted a patent for molding and casting bells. Andrew Meneely became an apprentice to Julius Hanks in Gibbonsville in either 1819 or 1820. He was the son of Andrew James and Eleanor Cobb Meneely, who were described as poor Irish immigrants, and apparently lived in Port Schuyler, which is now the southern end of Waterville. His father died when he was about 13, and he must have been self-educated. We have a few hints as to the Meneelys back in Ireland. In 1953, a Pennsylvania minister speaks of the Meneely, M-I-N-E-E-L-Y family that settled near Johnstown in 1771. One member of the family, John Meneely, became a minister in the Church of the Brethren. In 1937, we'd shipped a bell to Alaska, incidentally loading it on a boat in Albany, where it went down the Hudson, down through the Panama Canal and up to Seattle, where it had to wait for the supply schooner for the little mission that it was eventually going to. While waiting there, Captain J. Meneely, who was on a British freighter, captain of the freighter as a matter of fact, saw the bell and sent us a short note on the back of his card saying, "Bred and born in Holywood County, Downs, in Ireland. Have not heard the name other than my own immediate family." There was a late president of Wheaton College who was a Meneely. My father met him first when he was a professor at Dartmouth, and Dad was putting the chime in there. We never found any family connection. Then there's the late story from the late Dr. Rainey of Troy, who studied part of his time in Dublin and said that his landlady was a Mrs. Meneely. In 1949, we had a letter from Mrs. Norman Han of Toronto. She was the daughter of Robert John Meneely, spelled M-A-N-E-E-L-Y, who settled in Newburgh. And she spoke of her uncle, Benjamin Hanks, because he was nicknamed Red Hank because of the color of his hair. Getting back to Andrew Meneely's apprenticeship, I think we ought to draw a little picture of just what apprenticeship meant in those days. A man would take someone in as an apprentice teach him everything that he could, with the full realization that eventually the apprentice would have served his term and would go out and start his own business in direct competition. It must have been that the feeling was that this was a growing country and there was plenty of room for everyone. And remember that Colonel Benjamin Hanks not only kept his foundry going in Mansfield, Connecticut, but started one up with his son Julius in Troy. The Troy foundry, incidentally, is now the site of Teledyne Gurley, formerly William and L.E. Gurley, who are world famous as manufacturers of surveying instruments. Part of Andrew's training was in the manufacture of surveying instruments. And for that part, he was sent to Auburn, New York, where Horatio taught him the trade. It was then commonly spoken of as mathematical instruments. So while he was in Auburn, Felina Hanks, who was the daughter of Rodney, came to visit her cousin Horatio and her Aunt Jerusha. And in 1826, they were married. And that same year, Andrew opened up his business at the Gibbonsville site that had been operated by Benjamin and Julius. It was a year before that Julius Hanks advertised that he had moved from Gibbonsville and established himself in Troy. In 1830, Alpheus and Truman Hanks purchased the establishment. In 1834, Oscar Hanks announced that he was the successor to A&T Hanks at the old stand. There is a Julius Hanks bell now in the possession of the Rensselaer County Historical Society, which was acquired by my father from an old church which was being torn down up in what we call upstate New York. People in New York City think that we live in upstate, but we have a different viewpoint. So now we have 3 establishments, all growing out of Colonel Benjamin Hanks. One in Mansfield, one in Troy, and one in Gibbonsville. Presumably, these were all competing. I would not be surprised to learn that Benjamin, or perhaps Julius, actually helped Andrew finance his start in the business. I see now it could not have been Benjamin because he died in 1824. Now let me read directly from the paper written by Emily Guile. The foundry in Gibbonsville was typical of most colonial foundries. It consisted of a few modest wooden buildings which were located on a part of the site later occupied by Meneely and Company. More and more attention was given to the founding of bells, and gradually the manufacture of mathematical instruments was abandoned. For a number of years, Andrew had studied how to obtain the best form for bells, the means of producing the best combination of metals in their manufacture, and the proper degree of heat to use in order to give the bell a melodious sound and a sure strength. As a result, he was able to predict with accuracy the weight and tone of each bell cast. Such precision in bell founding had never previously been obtained. It had been common in the United States and abroad to chisel off portions of bells after they were cast to secure the proper tone. His aim was not only to have a successful business, but to approach perfection in the finished product, and in this way build up a reputation that would be permanent. Nothing pleased him more than to see articles of a similar type placed beside his own for comparison. He took great interest in community affairs. He was president of the village of West Troy in 1839 and again in 1843. He had many friends whose welfare he was constantly endeavoring to promote, not only by advice but by pecuniary aid. Andrew was noted for his various charitable activities. Yet even with his many charities and his participation in the life of the community, he felt that his main duty was to the local Reformed Dutch Church, of which he was a ruling elder. Perhaps the following incident will depict his character more clearly. A young gentleman from out of town called to see Andrew on a Sunday morning in order to purchase a bell. Andrew refused to do business with him on Sunday. He requested that this man go to church with him, remain overnight at his house so they could discuss business early Monday morning. The gentleman declined Andrew's offer and said that he had to be home by night. He wanted to visit the bell foundry and look at the various sizes and patterns of bells, but Andrew refused. Seeing he could not persuade Andrew into negotiating business on Sunday, he left for home. The following day, he addressed a letter to the Reverend Andrew Meneely containing an order for a bell. Later, this man remarked to a friend that he was just as well satisfied with the bell as if he had seen it that Sunday morning. Andrew received many orders for his bells and chimes, and they won many prizes at fairs and expositions. Business grew almost too rapidly. Andrew's health became impaired through overwork. In 1835, he took Jonas V. Outhout, O-U-T-H-O-U-T, into partnership. And the name was changed from Andrew Meneely to Meneely and Outhout. There's a Meneely and Outhout surveyor's compass in a collection of instruments at Teledyne Gurley here in Troy, which was made by the late chairman of the board, Mr. Charles Smart. In 1841, Outhout left, and the firm again became Andrew Meneely until 1849, when Andrew's oldest son, Edwin, was made a partner. In preparation for this, Edwin had been employed in the foundry in a more or less menial capacity since he was 14. The company now became Andrew Meneely and Son. He was confined to his home most of the time, and Edwin carried on the business. His health seemed to improve about a year later, and he went back to the foundry, but it must have been too much of a strain, and his doctor advised him that he should go south for the winter. He did so, going to Cuba, and this trip gives us a picture of his wife, Felina Hanks Meneely. We get this from what was then known as a passport. It has no picture, of course, but it was issued in January 1951, signed by Secretary of State Daniel Webster. Age, 47 years. Stature, 5 feet 2 3/4 inches, English. Forehead, ordinary. Eyes, black. Nose, Grecian. Mouth, rather small. Chin, rather small. Hair, black. Complexion, dark. To go out a few years, when there was a family reunion at Mansfield, a newspaper article said, "The aged widow, Mrs. Meneely, has been styled the mother of bells, but with due propriety might be termed the Queen of Bells, B-E-L-L-E-S, from her stately form and dignified bearing and well-preserved features. She still retains much of the freshness and beauty of youth." May I make a correction? The passport was issued in 1851. The trip to Cuba was no healthier than it would be today under Castro, and Andrew died that year. My grandfather, Clinton, was only 12 years old. In Andrew's will, he left a number of things to his wife, but he put his 2 sons, Edwin and George, as head of the family and charged them with taking care of their mother, 2 sisters, Eleanor and Eugenia, and Clinton. They were charged also with giving them a suitable education. And we know that Eugenia was educated at what was then called the Troy Female Seminary. Mrs. Willard's seminary at Troy. This is now Emma Willard School, and there have been 3 Eugenia Menelys who have attended. The second being my aunt, Eugenia Snelling, and the third being my sister, Eugenia Meneely Cluett, who lives in Guilford, Connecticut. After their father's death, Edwin and Andrew formed a partnership, and the business was known as Andrew Meneely's Sons. George had been helping out the foundry for about 2 years before his father died. Shortly after Andrew's death, Mr. Hitchcock, the foundry foreman, left, and George took his place. He was in complete charge of the foundry, while the office business was handled by Edwin. The foundry was rebuilt in 1852. The original building, which resembled a barn, had been replaced by a brick structure, but this proved to be too small. So it was partly torn down, enlarged, rebuilt, and a new large furnace installed. In addition, they purchased an adjoining lot and built a carpenter's shop. As finally completed, the foundry covered a total of 9 lots. The business failed in 1857 and property title passed to Andrew's wife. However, the founding of Bell's continued under the name of Andrew Meneely's Agents. Shortly afterward, the name Andrew Meneely's Sons was resumed and continued until 1863, when it was changed to E.A. and G.R. Meneely. The business was carried on primarily by mail, and many of the letters sent in were addressed to Troy rather than West Troy. And as a result, E.A. and G.R. Meneely maintained a post office box in Troy. They also had an agent in New York City, Fairbanks and Company, the well-known scale manufacturers. They were located on Broadway, and they displayed a sign in their window saying agency for Meneely bells. And they had a gilt bell with the name Meneely Bells on it hung in front of this sign. From 1857 to 1863, each bell carried the inscription from Meneely's Foundry, West Troy, and the year that the bell was cast. In 1863, they shortened the firm's name cast on the bells to Meneely's. My grandfather, Clinton Hanks Meneely, was employed as a clerk and bookkeeper at the Foundry from 1857 to 1861. He had an exceptionally keen ear for music and was often called upon to give his opinion as to the precise tone of a bell. He usually accompanied the chimes and bells to their destination to see that they were properly installed. He also played the Meneely chimes at many fairs and expositions. He had received a good education, and in addition to his work for his brothers, he maintained a metal business of his own. And Andrew Meneely's sons were one of the customers. When he was 21 years old, Grandfather left to fight in the Civil War. He started with the rank of major in the 2nd New York Cavalry Regiment. Shortly after, was transferred to the regular army and served as chief of staff with General James Wadsworth. He later served on the staffs of Generals Couch and Palmer, and was in all the important battles of the Army of the Potomac, from the Battle of Gettysburg to the end of the war. Later, he was Chief Mustering Out Officer of the Department of Pennsylvania, and then of the Department of Kentucky. He was promoted by brevet to Lieutenant Colonel and then Colonel, before he was discharged in 1866. I recently had the pleasure of presenting to my son, Major Clinton T. Meneely, United States Air Force, the commission to Major Clinton H. Meneely when he was transferred into the regular army, which was signed by both Stanton and Abraham Lincoln. In addition to this, there was a presentation sword and a citation given to him in March of 1863 opposite Fredericksburg, Virginia, by the officers of the 2nd Infantry New York Volunteers in gratitude for the help he had given them when they arrived. This regiment had been raised in Troy, which they spoke of as Grandfather's native city. Apparently, there was not too much distinction made between Troy and West Troy at that time. Grandfather had married Josephine Elizabeth Roof, R-O-O-F, who is the descendant of Johannes Roof, R-U-E-F-F or R-U-O-F-F, it has been spelt both ways, who came over in 1759 and set up a trading post at Fort Stanwix, New York, now a part of Rome, New York. Grandfather wrote many letters to her while he was in the service, and one of them is quite prophetic. I I believe it had to do with the final settlement of Andrew Meneely's estate, which could not be done until the youngest living child had reached 21. In any case, he wrote, "I do not want any feeling of obligation to anyone. Thus far, I have emphatically cared for myself in and out of the Army. That I can continue to do so, I am sanguine of. Therefore, I emphatically want to be independent." After his discharge in 1866, grandfather returned to West Troy and for about 2 years maintained a business of buying and selling Army surplus. Clothing, equipment, blankets, and so forth, which were stored at his brother's foundry. The brothers had changed the name to E.A. and G.R. Meneely. There was no great future in this, and he started looking around for something more permanent. One story is that he approached his brothers about joining them in the foundry, and that they turned it down because they felt there was not enough room for another partner. Looking back to what grandfather had written about maintaining his independence, this may or may not have been the case. But we have to remember that he had spent 4 years working for his brothers, and while this was being done in the office and out on the road, I know from my own personal experience that in a small foundry, it's impossible to work in the office without a great many of the technical features rubbing off. And there's no question of what he learned a lot about the operation of the foundry itself, with the possible exception of how to design the sweeps from which the bells were made. So his decision was to become a bell founder on his own. He first approached Jonathan W. Freeman in the hope that Mr. Freeman would lend him enough money to enable him to establish his foundry. This did not materialize. He then approached George Kimberly, who was an outstanding merchant in West Troy and was the brother-in-law of Edwin Meneely. Kimberly agreed to enter in a partnership with grandfather Clinton and the articles of partnership for Meneely and Kimberly were drawn up on June 11, 1870. 7 months later, the first bell was cast. You may well wonder how grandfather and his partner were able to get a building put up and all the equipment necessary in such a short time. We have to remember, excuse me, that Troy was the real industrial center. The first Bessemer steel furnace in this country was located in Troy. Many stove factories were here. Transportation facilities were excellent. It was the head of navigation on the Hudson River and a terminal for both the Erie and the Champlain canals. It was served by 3 railroads, which may have had different names back then, but which later were known as the New York Central, the Boston and Maine, and the Delaware and Hudson. There were many foundries in the area working with iron, brass, bronze, was a center of stove manufacture. It was also an area filled with brickyards. In fact, Sam Wilson, who was the prototype, if that's the right term, of Uncle Sam, in addition to supplying meat to the Army in the War of 1812, operated a brickyard. The design of the foundry was obviously copied from that of his brothers. In addition to his own experience there, the partners had the help of 3 former employees of the Waterville concern. There's Edward Dwyer, who had had 15 years of experience in all the aspects of the business except the making of sweeps. Daniel Donald, another foreman, had worked for Andrew Meneely for 10 years, and then had worked for Clinton's brother. Then they had Philip Brock, whose father had been employed by Andrew Meneely, and who made the structures for setting the sweeps up at the new foundry. They probably also had help from Mr. Hitchcock, who had been foreman in Waterville and had come over to Troy and set up the firm of Jones and Hitchcock. He later became an agent in Chicago for Meneely and Kimberly. The building probably occupied 2 lots, numbers 22 and 24 River Street. The front section on the street was 2-story, the lower story being an office, and the upper a carpenter shed. In back of this was a long open foundry with a dirt floor, and in back of that the furnace and storage sheds which could be reached through the alley in the rear. On the south side was a relatively small open space into which horse-drawn trucks could be backed for loading and unloading. It would seem that everything was there, both the know-how and the availability of the necessary materials, except the knowledge of how to design the sweeps. And grandfather made this his study. He read all the books that he could find on the subject, and particularly a book which had been published in France in 1751, which gave an accurate description and the details of how sweeps were designed. I believe I have this book up in that box in the attic. Meneely and Kimberly began advertising in October 1870. They also brought out their first catalog, and this was sent to everyone who inquired. Naturally, the business was conducted by mail, and grandfather began by writing letters to people he had met while in the Army who had expressed an interest. The answers began to arrive very soon, many of them being addressed simply to Meneely of Troy. As we know, Meneely and Kimberly was not the first bell foundry to be established in Troy proper. Julius Hanks had set one up in 1825 or 26. Jones and Hitchcock having been a former foreman for Edmund Meneely had set up in Troy about 1850, only about a block and a half away from where Meneely and Kimberly was eventually set up. Troy bells, therefore, were not uncommon. In fact, Jones and Hitchcock was also known as the Troy Bell Foundry. However, Meneely bells were something else. And the combination of the name Meneely and the Troy were very confusing to the people who were writing in. Coupled with the fact that the Waterville Company was maintaining a post office box in Troy, there's no doubt that what correspondence got completely mixed up. Now we see quite a change in attitude that must have grown up over the years. Unlike the Hanks, who had set each other up, and even Andrew Meneely, in competing businesses, the older brothers of Clinton not only felt the competition, but believed that this was unfair competition because of the use of the name Meneely. And they started legal action, which began with a trial before an arbitrator in December 1871. This case seesawed back and forth through a number of courts until it was finally decided in September of 1875 by the Court of Appeals. And without going into all the details, perhaps the reading of Judge Rapolo's final decision will state the case. In the present case, the injunction consists wholly of a prohibition of the use of the name Meneely in any way. It is in conflict with all the cases upon the subject. If the evidence showed any attempt by the defendants, by means of catalogs or by any other contrivance, to induce the belief that the firm of Meneely and Kimberly was the successor of Andrew Meneely or the managers of the plaintiff's Bell Foundry, those acts might have been restrained. But not such injunction was granted or asked for. The use of the name Meneely in any way was all that it enjoined, and that was the very thing which should not have been enjoined. We think the general term did right in reversing the judgment and ordering a new trial, and the order must consequently be affirmed, etc., etc. In summary, there was nothing in the will of Andrew Meneely which prohibited his son Clinton from carrying on a business of bell founding in Troy under his own name or the name of Meneely and Kimberly. If Andrew had conferred upon his sons Edwin and George the exclusive right to use his name Andrew Meneely as a trademark, then the plaintiffs would have had the exclusive right to use the name of Andrew Meneely. If this were the case, then Clinton would not have had the right to establish himself in the bell business, nor to refer to the name of Andrew Meneely in any way. In short, it was found that the error of the referee was in his finding that Andrew Meneely became the owner of the name Meneely as a trademark, rather than the name Andrew Meneely. This became a landmark case in New York State with regard to the use of a person's name in his business, and is still referred to students at the Albany Law School. Transcripts of the hearings give us a lot of information about how the business was carried on. Advertising, solicitation by mail, and so forth. They tell us very little about the technical aspects. Now we have to remember that I am 2 generations removed from this, and I don't remember my grandfather ever discussing it with me in any way, probably because I was too young. My father, of course, was much closer to it, and he had strong feelings. Actually, both sides seem to have strong cases, proven by the fact that different judges or arbitrators gave opposing answers. Since both companies operated till about 1950, the rifts certainly did not hurt the technical side of the industry. In fact, the strong competition may have spurred both branches to greater efforts to perfect their products. The real tragedy lay in the break within the family. Perhaps Andrew's widow, Felina Hanks Meneely, who lived until 1887, may have had the most difficult time of all because she had to choose between her sons. The real bitterness seems to have been between grandfather and his oldest brother, Edwin. Edwin had taken the place of his father, and in many ways, grandfather's attitude seemed to be much like that of the rebellious youth that we see so often today. His other brother, George, left the business in 1876, a year after the final decision was made. Whether this decision had anything to do with his leaving, we do not know. We do know that the rift between grandfather and Edwin carried right down to the day of Edwin's death. In January 1897. And my father tells me of grandfather sitting at home, knowing that his brother was dying, and hoping for the call so he could go over and they could have a last-minute reconciliation. The call never came. The effect of this to me and to my brothers and sisters was that we were part of a